Given the title, the other thing, this panel, we hope to be a little bit different than the last panel, not necessarily better or worse, but because of some of the intelligence that's in the room, right? We want to make this engaging, right? So we want you all to develop your questions, your comments, and so when these folks are finished with their statements, we're going to open the floor for some questions from the audience, right, as well as myself, and start to build and organize for some solutions, hopefully. I was about to say, given the title of our, or the theme of our panel, policing in Palestine, I thought it would be good to kind of start on the ground. And so I had asked Ryan to talk a little bit about what policing, right, is like in Gaza, in the occupied territories, from her lens as an organizer. Right, so.
Thank you, yeah, of course. Do we need the mic? We can just use our yes.
If you want to project, you teach your voice, yeah.
I'm going to start without it, but if at any point anybody can't hear, let me know this here is quite powerful. So, just for context, in Palestine, occupied Palestine is broken up by the occupation into 4 different sections, being Jerusalem or El-Quds, the West Bank, the historic interior, and Gaza. And so policing in each one of the regions looks slightly different from the next. Also for context, I think it's important to know the population in Palestine. There are 7.5 million Palestinians living in occupied Palestine. And the reason that I wanted to mention this is because if you were just to do a Google search of population of Palestinians in Palestine, you would see the number 2 million, but that only accounts for the Palestinians that are living in the interior of Palestine, which the Zionist settler state calls Israel. And so that number, the 2 million, contributes to the erasure of the Palestinian identity, and it's false. So now when we talk about policing in Palestine, in Jerusalem, and we want to refrain from saying East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, this is the language of the colonizer, the whole thing is Jerusalem and the whole thing is Palestine. And so in Jerusalem, the policing is overseen by the settler Zionist state, as well as in the interior. And now when it comes to the West Bank, what we refer to as the arm of the settler Zionist regime is the Palestinian Authority. And if you're not familiar, this is a small political faction that has been put in place by Western imperialism in order to police Palestinians in the West Bank. There are 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, and prevents them from organizing and polices them and helps to gather information for the settler Zionist regime in exchange for some monetary gain and survival. And then finally, when we look at policing in Gaza, as we know, Gaza has been under siege for almost 20 years. There is a small police force in Gaza which probably looks different than policing in most places in the world, because these folks who work together in Gaza are, I actually this morning just saw a video of the police chief in Gaza going around from person to person to check in on other Palestinian families who are impacted by the heightened genocide, and also shared that his family members, including children of his, have been martyred. And so policing in Gaza does look different internally. However, as we know, all of occupied Palestine is, because of the reality of the settler Zionist regime, other than that, a small impact in the West Bank is overseen by the settler entity.
We're going to bring the discussion stateside now. So we're going to open the floor to Luke's going to give his opening statement, talking about his experiences at Rutgers. And if you look at the bios, Luke wrote his senior thesis on divestment as it relates to Vietnam, right, Africa, and Palestine, in addition to joining both in campuses. So we're going to open the floor to him.
Hello, thanks for coming, everybody. Trying to think, where do you want me to start? My statement. Yeah, I mean, so first and foremost, I guess I would classify myself as a historian. That's what I graduated with, a degree at Rutgers, my undergraduate, and last year was definitely a blur. I initially started my senior thesis looking at the Black student movement as it related to Rutgers, and found myself really interested in the South African divestment movement. Then October happened, and the paper kind of took a life of its own. I had always been in and out involved with organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine. But what I came to find in my research was that the divestment movement by no means starts with BDS as we know today, but rather in fact goes back to obviously South Africa and especially Vietnam. Particularly at Rutgers, there was a very vigorous movement to abolish ROTC. It got very violent at times, of course, to divest from arms manufacturers and defense contracts, so on and so forth. So that brought me naturally to the encampments, which I would say it's hard to put in words what the experiences were like in the encampments. But to put it succinctly, I would say it really felt like we were building something, like building towards a new world. We had religious services, for Muslims, for Christians, for Jewish folks. The donations and just the outpouring of love from the communities was just astronomical. Like we had to tell people like stop donating things because that's how great the support was. And yeah, I mean, I also want to say though that in those experiences, they're definitely like we're housed. We're not facing an ethnic cleansing genocide of 75 ongoing years. So as great as those experiences are, I do want to reflect on that in this moment that this is life for countless of people essentially displaced in Gaza, but as well as Sudan, the Congo, and so forth.
But just to pick up some from our last panel, what Brother DeRuba was talking about, Marvin teaches African American Studies, taught African American Studies, is currently teaching that at Northern State Prison. So I want him to talk a little bit about that connection, that solidarity between the Black Freedom Movement and the Palestinian Liberation Movement from his perspective.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Well, just a bit of a correction. I only made it one summer teaching at Southwood State Prison for obvious reasons, and which I'll explain later. But I just like to start off by thanking my parents, because very early on, they made sure that my brothers and sisters kind of understood our place in the society in a sense, and to never get our hopes upon this settler colony as it existed. That was rule number one in a household, is to understand your place and understand that you could never be accepted or be a part of this settler colony as it existed. That's pretty much what my mother and father, not only did they teach us that, but they ultimately modeled that. And many of my brothers and sisters would go on, various activists. I'm from New Jersey, Passaic, New Jersey. I taught for 31 years, seemed like 35, but I was 31. Thariah and I taught together at Passaic High School, practicing fugitive pedagogy, because there was also another dream that my parents instilled in me, was that, you may not be able to overthrow the system in just one swing. but your job is to create students. That's your only job, is to ultimately create students that would do that particular work. And that's what Lariah and I pretty much practice at the institution she still works at, that I worked at for 31 years. And so when you look at this idea of policing and this exchange of technology and ideas, I mean, listen, colonizers ultimately exchange intelligence. So they watch what other colonizers are doing. If that works there, then they try it in other locations. You think about it. When they begin to pass slave codes, one state would begin, and then other states would mimic what would work. So it's pretty much the same thing that happens in terms of policing. The other thing my dad always taught me, besides fuck the police before NWA, literally, he go on police stations, my brothers would get arrested, literally grabbing police officers by the collar, because that was the type of dude he was, because he's passed on. But he also understood policing and just understood that, as the Rubo always teaches us, that it's really just an armed agent of the state. It can't be anything else. So he taught us to give up on the delusion that you could reform that shit. You can't do it. It can't be reformed. It was designed to do exactly what it does. Here in the USA, or whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in South Africa, or whether it's in the Congo, wherever it's at, it was designed to do. There's nothing you can do except abolish it and ultimately overthrow it. And so when I taught for that one semester at the Southwood State Prison, they ultimately got rid of me after that summer, because I understood what my mission was going to be right there, was to radicalize those, and not that I radicalized them, because they were already radicalized, well-read when I got there. The question one inmate said, "Are you?" Because if you stand up here and you haven't done your reading, they're going to be in your ass, and it's going to be a very long semester for you. And so luckily I had done some reading, thanks to brothers like TJ, brothers like Dr. Ball here, and others who have encouraged me, from a distance, to continue to study, to continue to do my reading. But ultimately what happened is that I got let go, because I tried to create a program to get books into the prison on the side, which you're not supposed to do, but that was all right, because I knew that I was only going to be there for one semester. So whatever I could get in there while I was there, that's exactly what I was trying to do. And it happened to get back to the higher ups in the prison. And so they told me not to come to work on Friday, literally. And so I figured it was over. But I didn't know that the inmates had started a petition. And so they called me on a Sunday and said, we need to have a meeting on a Monday. And so when I had the meeting, they said, well, you were the topic of discussion the whole weekend. They had this petition going around and everything. They said, so what are we going to do with you? We can't fire you, because if we fire you now, then the inmates are already saying the reason I'm getting fired, is because of what I'm saying, the books that I'm encouraging them to ultimately get, and that stuff. So they said, we can't fire you. So when we got back to there on Monday, the brothers came up and they were saying, listen, man, we thought you were gone. They're coming up hugging, which is another thing you can't do. But again, I knew I was only going to be there for a semester, so I was doing everything that I could there. And so they said, so what are we going to do? I said, well, shit, since they're going to fire my ass anyway after this, we got to stay radical with the teachings. Now, I was ultimately able to get books in. What I did was I got a bunch of my friends to ultimately just send books. Look, I had all the numbers of all the inmates, and we just simply were able to send various books to them. So I would say my experience there for that one semester, I would say that those were the best read students that I've ever encountered in my 31 years of teaching. Not even close. The last thing, they tried to get one inmate by saying that they were giving out answers. And so they called me and they said, well, look at the essays. I said, okay, I'm looking at the essays now. And even though various individuals are sitting only 6 essays, so they're gonna have some of the same. Their approaches were different. Some were more moderate, some were more radical. And what I said to the person that was in charge of the program, I said, well, there's no way that you can prove that anybody cheated, so what are you gonna do? Well, ultimately they fired me, but that was okay. Because my purpose for being there was to add to the radicalization that was already there. I didn't create anything, it was already there. I just kind of kept the momentum going.
Ryan, I was wondering if you could possibly address some of the surveillance that exists both right in Gaza, but also the similarities and differences to what we might see here with students, professors, right?
Yeah, so within the 4 parts that the colonizers have divided Palestine into, there is heightened surveillance. Currently, there is an app called Blue Wolf, and it includes facial recognition as well as digital surveillance that extends to social media. And Palestinians, as they travel, the checkpoints are imposed on them through their travel. And so there's facial recognition at every point of travel. In Jerusalem, there are several instances that have been documented with the CCTV cameras where people say that the cameras extend to the inside of their homes. So there are Muslim women in Palestine who wear hijab inside their homes across Jerusalem and the West Bank because they have absolutely no privacy. This also extends to social media. It's very common that Palestinians are arrested for their social media posts, for attending a protest, for any attempt at organization. In Gaza, this is even more increased than all the other sections in Palestine, because in Gaza, every single cell phone that enters the city there is a technology that is installed on it, a certain spyware, where everything that people in Gaza say and do is monitored and recorded and used against the people in Gaza. And so, something that oftentimes gets left out when we talk about rights of Palestinians is their right to privacy. And so they do not have any rights to privacy, and their rights are infringed upon in their day-to-day life. There are even several instances where Palestinians are blackmailed by the colonizing state and are put in positions to share information and to serve as infiltrators for the state because, and we have seen this with Palestinians who identify as LGBTQ, and while we have the entity going around waving all sorts of flags in performative sort of lens, but in fact blackmailing Palestinians who have further marginalized identities, and they have been able to very easily do so because of the spyware and the high-end digital surveillance across. And this has started in the 1960s, and in the United States and other Western countries, we're seeing that this technology that the Zionist state uses is inspirational for Western imperialism, because it then becomes that the Palestinians are used as guinea pigs for these other nations, so that this spyware could be extended across different places.
I'm going to come to you next. I'm going to sort of read an excerpt from an article that was on from the Marshall Project online. This is back in May during the student encampment. And I want Luke, if possible, to speak to some of your personal experiences. This was just a police sniper stood watch on the roof at Indiana University. An officer fired beanbag rounds at UCLA protesters. Protesters at Emory University were met with rubber bullets and tear gas. Police have frequently used aggressive and militarized tactics in arresting nearly 3,000 tied to the pro-Palestinian protests that have swept dozens of college campuses last spring. These arrests have mainly come after tent encampments set up by students protesting Israel's war on Gaza and occupation of Palestinian territories, and demanding that their universities disclose and divest any financial investment they may have that benefit Israel. Students make up most of the arrests, which also include professors, staff, alumni, and some people unaffiliated with the schools. Some protesters have reported stitches, broken bones, and concussions from interactions with police. So Luke, again, who participated in both Newark and New Brunswick encampments, could you speak to your personal experiences of interaction with police or what you might have witnessed during the encampments?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the major things and then go to my more experience, so generalize, and then I'll go to myself. It was scary. I mean, simply all I can say is like, thank God we didn't have like another Kent State, that we didn't have another Jackson State. I think it was timing. I'm bad with timing. But I think it was like the second night before, New Brunswick got swept. New Brunswick got swept very quickly, like 3 days. And that was the night where I think both were happening simultaneously, where Columbia students occupied, I forget what hall, but named it Hein Hall in remembrance of Hein Job, who was murdered by the occupation. And NYPD, in SWAT gear came in. Later came out too that they fired live rounds in the building, mass arrested everybody, and I believe, might be wrong on this, that was like one of the first times that cops came on the campus at Columbia since '68, during the occupations during Vietnam. At New Brunswick, and then simultaneously too, this is UCLA is happening, where quite literally a lynch mob was allowed to attack the encampment. LAPD stood by. No arrests really were made that night, and it was only, of course, afterwards where people made an uproar that they maybe put some charges here and there, but very light, right? So we're all seeing this, on our phones at night in New Brunswick. And day 3 of New Brunswick, the movement in general sees that, okay, we have to escalate, right? We have to put pressure on the administration. And the idea is to do a wake-up call, disrupt finals, disrupt the casual business of the university. And that happens, all is good, and basically the response for the administration was, okay, we'll tolerate you camping out for a little bit, you can do that, but now that you're like interfering with the usual whatever business of the university to extents we can't let you, we're gonna clear the encampment. There's a lot of back and forth throughout the day, they're threatening, they're pushing back deadlines, because they're screwing with us, essentially. And this is, meanwhile, people are in negotiations to try and get any of the demands. And basically, and videos show afterwards, we had generally known that the police response was going to be massive. But looking at it after too, so New Brunswick campus, you have College Avenue here, and then RUPD, which is a police force in its own right, they have guns, they're able to arrest. They're just, part of the college or whatever. Their station is a bit over across town. And people, when, after dispersing, took videos, and they basically saw, I believe it was Monmouth County. I don't know why it was Monmouth County, because Rutgers, New Brunswick is in Middlesex. But Monmouth County SWAT bands. They had, assault rifles, tactical gear, everything, and they were ready to, crack heads essentially. There was, because we, as student organizers, and New Brunswick is kind of a small town in a way, we had connections to folks who were part of the Robert Wood Johnson, the nurses unions there, and insiders there, and we come to find out too that there was an announcement made amongst hospital staff that they were preparing for, I forget the exact quote, but basically something along the lines of like a mass trauma event. That's just what the staff was like, told, like mass trauma event. And then on top of this too, it was, the university president had made a university-wide email saying like, we're gonna clear this encampment essentially. Like we've exhausted all options. And because of this too, a great contingent of Zionist agitators came, and we were scared it was going to become like UCLA essentially. Like they were, cordoned off by police. But it was very, strange in one way, but it makes sense when you think about it a little more critically. They were waving American flags, chanting USA, USA, so forth. But the New Brunswick encampment ultimately, and thank God, without really any immediate violence, dismantled. Nobody was hurt physically. Well, there were assaults, but I digress. That's something else. So New Brunswick cleared very quickly. Newark lasted 30s. Do we know, Dave? 30? 40? 40 days. 40 days. Thank you. Newark lasted a lot longer. 40 days. The style of Newark was definitely very different because we saw that, okay, we gotta play the waiting game. We have to, like the university, unfortunately, they're gonna force us to negotiate, right? So use the encampment as leverage to advocate for divestment. Newark, I was not there for when they were cleared because, which I'll get into now, but when we're doing, going to the audience, maybe some people can speak to that because I know some people were directly there. But I saw the videos, they're pushing teachers, they cleared folks out very quickly, so forth. Now myself personally, I was arrested, but after the fact. Let me try and make this not convoluted because I know I don't really want to pass to other people. So I'm going to say this allegedly because we're still in court over this, right? So allegedly, I had written using spray chalk. You could wash chalk off, right? Pro-Palestinian messaging, and I got through RUPD, and somebody notified, told me something, and I was like, okay, let me walk away, let me get out of here. So I was detained, and basically the police told me and I was refusing to identify myself, and the police basically told me something of okay, well either you identify yourself, you give us your name, date of birth, or you give us an ID, or we'll cuff you, process you, whatnot. It's not obstruction in New Jersey, that doesn't constitute as not refusing to identify, right? And that was one of the charges that at least the school put on me, was refusal to follow lawful orders, right, by police. So we're going back and forth. I'm just telling them hey, it's spray chalk, it's washable. And it becomes such a commotion too. A lot of people are coming around that they give up on it, right? So they let me go. Didn't have to give them my name. And comes to bite my ass a little bit later when I just got a random email, 11 at one night. This is while I'm still at Newark encampment. That I was being charged. What was it? 4th degree is the highest. It's fourth degree. Criminal mischief in the 4th degree for graffiti, which was a felony charge because it's upgraded at 4th degree, with damages exceeding supposedly thousands of dollars for chalk, mind you. And that there's a university disciplinary process, there's a criminal process, and there's RUPD in this weird part too. It still doesn't make total sense to me. And basically RUPD banned me. I'm banned from Rutgers. I can't go onto Rutgers property. I'm considered quote unquote trespassing, and they said in the letter, like, if you're found on the property, we'll arrest you. We'll charge you for trespassing, essentially. I got my degree, so that doesn't matter. I'm not going back. And the university disciplinary process is a little different. So the university wants me to fork over like $1,500 for the supposed damages. And they've basically banned me. Like, I can't re-enroll if I want to go to grad school at Rutgers, or if just whatever. I'm not able to do so now unless I fork over that money to them. So that's my more personal experience.
People interpret what is now said to be this great new ceasefire?
Yes.
That's a good question. That's a great question in relation to the ceasefire agreement yesterday. So the people in Gaza deserve to breathe, and they deserve joy. So although that we recognize that this is only the slowing down of a genocide, the genocide has not stopped and the occupation has not stopped. We still recognize the people's right to catch their breath. And, you know, I and Palestinians across the diaspora and across occupied Palestine, we are joyful for their joy because they get to catch their breath a little bit. We did see yesterday several Palestinians martyred and a child today just before the first panel. I have not had an opportunity to look in the last couple of hours. However, and we recognize that we do not trust the colonizer. We do not trust anybody who is in alignment of the colonizer. And so Palestinians know that historically we are not waiting for the word and agreement of the occupying forces. And with that being said, we still know that our people need these moments to try as best as they possibly can to gather themselves. At least 80% of Gaza has been destroyed and demolished. And contrary to Western media, at least 250,000 Palestinians have been martyred, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health.
I just had a question for you also. I am in Maplewood, which is the Columbia, like that's where I got these information from. But my question was more, I mean, I know this, like, I believe that the most anti-Semitic thing somebody could be is a Zionist, but like, how do you navigate relationships with peers, relationships with teachers, parents who are very starkly contrasting your kind of beliefs that you're like, basically, you know what I'm saying.
Thank you, that's a really great question. So the way that I navigate these relationships is that I don't have them. That's how something that we don't want to engage in, and some of you may be familiar with this term, is the word normalization. And normalization in context of the settler Zionist state is recognizing its right to exist. And so anybody who upholds any thoughts around two-state solution, or anybody who justifies in any way the ongoing genocide of the settler colony is engaging in normalization. And so once I pick up on this what some people present as their truth, which we know is falsehood, and we're seeing the fragility of the settler Zionist state in its responses to the resistance in Palestine and to all the people internationally who have organized against them.
Thank you for an awesome panel. This question's for Marvin. So you said that policing as an extension of the colonial project is an exchange of ideas and technology. I was wondering if you could speak more to this exchange, the mechanisms involved in this exchange.
Yes, thanks for the question. So since after 9/11, there's been an exchange program. Various federal, local, state agencies have been going to Israel to basically get various forms of training. even farther back than that, in Georgia, they've been doing it probably for 30, 35 years. So it's even longer. So as I talked about this idea of exchanging, look, independently, each, whether it's the IDF or American policing, is simply horrible, independent of any exchanges. So when you bring these two elements together, you even get a heightened form of aggression. So for instance, the knee on the neck that we all witnessed with George Floyd is pretty much an import that's been practiced on Palestinians probably for about 72 years or so. And so an export would be stop and frisk that the Israelis borrowed from pretty much the New York City Police Department. The idea of these, what do you call them, mechanical dogs, I think they are, the mechanical dogs, which were created by an American company, which ultimately was supposed to be, they originally were not supposed to be used on humans, but then of course they're used in Palestine. So that tells you something right there, is the idea that part of the colonization, or prior to the colonization, is the dehumanization of folks. And if you're in a marginalized group, particularly black folks or people of color in this country, you kind of understand that. So I was just going over, not that I understand a lot of Dr. Sister Sylvia Winter, because she's a lot of very abstract. But the one thing I do understand is the 1992 document that she put out, the NHIs, and No Humans Involved, which the Los Angeles Police Department used to refer to pretty much black folks who weren't working. And they would say over the walkie-talkies, NHI, which means No Humans Involved. So you understand that the very same way that black folks here are viewed. In fact, it was Wyatt T. Walker who he said, once you go to Palestine, he said, you can't really understand until you're there. And his words, this is 1979, he said that the Palestinians are the niggers of the Middle East. This was Wyatt T. Walker who basically said that. So yes, these exchange programs, whether it becomes drones or the uses of drones, all of these scanners, as Mariah has mentioned, are part of this exchange. And ultimately, when we see this, and we see it somewhere else, it's either originated here or is on its way. So wherever you see it, it needs to be stopped. Wherever we see it, it ultimately has to be stopped.
Glad to be here. My name is Kristen Bailey, 2018 Columbia graduate, alum of Spelman College 2022, and now I'm back here. But I think I would be remiss if I don't acknowledge the coming administration and the doubling down of fascism. We can all understand, like you said, knowing Black history in America and even immigrant history in America, that America has always practiced fascist practices and principles. But now we're in an administration that is planning to double down on fascism and perpetuate it on a national scale. My question is considering the information that everyone's talked about on the panel, how do we begin to resist here, the oncoming fascism regime, while also continuing to hold space and resisting further the fascist regimes globally? Like you said, there is always an exchange of, technology and information. We know starting today that there will be an executive order that will start to go after immigrants starting in Chicago. We can expect that if, the most marginalized people among us are going to be targeted, then soon it will trickle down to, people of color, Black people, trans people. So how do we go about practicing resistance in our day-to-day lives so that we can have a strong start on what can be a whirlwind of, an issue? So that's my question.
I'll share one thoughts, and then I'll pass to my fellow panelists here. I think one way would be for us to, first of all, recognize that liberation exists, and sometimes it's very hard for us in the West to even come to terms with that liberation is not just a theory. And so it's very important that we create community spaces here, and spaces like this, for instance, but that we support and uphold such spaces, because when we don't have that here, it becomes far more challenging to support that elsewhere. And we know that this capitalist society has us believe that individualism is the only way, when in fact individualism has caused us so much destruction. When we look at the global South and the cultures and faiths and practices of those in the global South, we see that their struggles are collective and they practice unity. And we can look to people in Palestine and across the globe to see what that unity looks like. And creating these community spaces and recognizing that, as I think Marv mentioned earlier, TJ perhaps, that we are not relying on the system for that. And also, coming to terms with that truly we live in a one-party system. So the face of the administration, the mask of the administration, how much does that really matter?
Yes, but I was just thinking about all of the things, all of the oppression that you were talking about. Trump wasn't in when all of this stuff was taking place, so I think sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that we get a better deal on one side versus the other. When the oppression comes, whichever party you choose, it's like pick your poison in terms of that. Yes, there are some nuances to what Trump is going to bring in terms of the administration. However, we can't forget that what's the number you just gave us? 250,000 is on Biden's watch. That's not Trump. So we can't ultimately confuse that.
I would say solidarity. Solidarity is the way to organize and combat it. There's a great talk on YouTube, a lecture given by Leslie Feinberg, who's a Bush lesbian and communist. And they basically, in their speech, they're talking about Stonewall and the gay liberation movement in the city. And there's a great moment in that talk where they're basically like, before the pride flag existed, because it was created around that time, the gay liberation movement was using the Viet Cong flag. And basically Feinberg, says something of the like of, if we didn't, the bombs are being dropped in our name, right? And if we don't stand in solidarity with those people, they would lose all the political willpower and just the soul of the movement. Solidarity, yeah.
This will be our last question and comment, but I'm glad you asked that question, Kirsten. One of the things that we've been trying to do in Maps for Freedom School is address that exact question. One of our founding documents is a piece by Grace Lee Boggs called Organization Means Commitment. Communication is the key. And since our inception, we've been trying to internalize that document. She criticizes some of the activists of the 60s and the 70s for being quote unquote on the go activists, right? So folks, they're jumping from protest to protest, right? Getting all hyped up, oh, we're gonna go, all right? But there's no foundation, right? There's no commitment. Folks aren't even meeting weekly at a set time. You show up whenever you want to the meeting. There's no accountability. So how are we gonna change the world, right? When we can't commit to each other to even meeting and discussing and learning, right, internally. And so that's what we're trying to do within our organization. We've made some really quality relationships with some folks who are in this room, Black Alliance for Peace and other organizations. And so that's how we're trying to grow, like you said, on a daily basis and to fight that double down on fascism. It's personal, it's individual, it's organizational. We grow internally, right, and then grow out from there. Thank you all so much for your patience.